The crowd laughed the moment Jonathan Roumie stepped onto the stage. No flashy suit, no gold watch, just a plain gray shirt, faded jeans, and an old pair of shoes that looked like they'd walked through years of stories. People whispered. Cameras zoomed in. Is that really him? Come on, he plays Jesus, and that's what he wears in real life? The laughter wasn't kind. It was the kind that cuts deeper than words, the kind that mocks humility. Paparazzi posted pictures with sarcastic captions. Hollywood's poorest star. Jonathan Roumie, the man who forgot to hire a stylist. Comment sections filled up fast. He's just pretending to be humble. Must be broke. Where's his fame money now? But Jonathan didn't respond. He smiled, waved to his fans, and thanked every single person who showed up. He spoke softly with genuine warmth, the kind of calm that only comes from someone who's at peace with himself. Reporters expected him to defend himself, to clap back, but he simply said, I came here to celebrate, not to compete. Still, the internet can be cruel. Memes spread. Videos mocked him. And for a while it looked like humility was being punished, and pride was winning. What no one knew was that Jonathan had a plan, a quiet, powerful plan. While critics laughed at his clothes, he was already working behind the scenes, meeting with charities, planning fundraisers, and signing papers that would soon change thousands of lives. He didn't announce it. He didn't post it. He just acted, because for him, kindness never needed an audience. Weeks later, those same voices that once laughed would fall silent when they discovered what Jonathan Roumie had done with the money he could have spent on designer suits and luxury cars. And when the truth came out, it didn't just humble his critics. It inspired millions around the world. They mocked his simplicity. But soon they'd learn that real greatness doesn't wear a label. It wears a heart. The red carpet was alive with glitter that night. Cameras flashed like lightning in a storm of fame. Reporters shouted the names of celebrities arriving in their million-dollar outfits, diamond necklaces, custom suits, and shoes that cost more than most people's rent. And then, walking quietly down that same carpet came Jonathan Roumie. No entourage. No stylist fixing his collar. No sunglasses or swagger. Just Jonathan, carrying the same calm presence that had made millions love him as Jesus in The Chosen. He wore a simple dark jacket over a light shirt. His shoes were clean but old, their soles softened by use. The lights reflected off the fabric, not because it glittered, but because it was real. For a few seconds, the noise died down. Cameras hesitated. Then came the laughter. Jonathan Roumie, straight out of goodwill, someone joked. A reporter chuckled. Another whispered to a cameraman, guess the TV Jesus couldn't turn his paycheck into Prada. He smiled, nodded politely, and kept walking. No bitterness, no flash of anger. He paused at the end of the carpet, gave a humble wave, and greeted fans leaning over the rails. He took selfies, signed autographs, even thanked a child who told him, "You're my hero." That's what made Jonathan different. He never forgot why he was there, not to be seen, but to serve. Still, as soon as the photos hit social media, the mockery exploded. Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, everywhere. Clips of him standing beside glittering A-listers were turned into memes. Captions read, "The Chosen," "To shop at the discount rack," "Method acting gone too far," "Hollywood's most humble or most broke." Influencers laughed. Comment sections filled with sarcasm. Some defended him, but their voices were drowned out by the noise. Jonathan's team suggested he release a statement, maybe joke about it, maybe spin it. He refused. He just said, "If my clothes distract people from my message, maybe they weren't listening in the first place." The days that followed were a test of spirit. Everywhere he went, people stared, and not with admiration, but with curiosity. He'd catch whispers in cafes. That's him. The guy who wore that outfit. But when he looked back, he didn't see mockery. He saw a world obsessed with appearance, desperate for meaning. And it broke his heart. So instead of defending himself, Jonathan doubled down on his mission. Between filming schedules, he met quietly with charity groups, homeless outreach programs, shelters struggling for funds. One of them, Grace House, was close to shutting down, the same neighborhood where he'd once volunteered before fame found him. He listened as a woman named Maria explained, We're feeding 100 families a week, but we might lose the building next month. Jonathan didn't hesitate. He nodded slowly and said, "Then we'll find a way to keep your doors open." He went home that night, opened his worn-out Bible, and prayed, not for revenge, not for reputation, but for strength to stay kind in a loud world. He wrote a single line in his journal: "Let them laugh at the clothes. Someday they'll understand the cause." The following morning, he began transferring a portion of his earnings into a private foundation he'd set up years ago. No press release, no announcement, just quiet action. When his accountant asked, "Do you want this to be public?" Jonathan smiled. "Not until it helps someone who needs it." Meanwhile, entertainment blogs continued their mockery. Fashion experts ranked his outfit as one of the top 10 red carpet disasters of the year. One late-night host joked, "Jonathan Roumie, walking proof that miracles don't happen in wardrobe." But while Hollywood laughed, a miracle was happening in silence. Behind the scenes, construction teams were being hired. Food supplies were being ordered. The same neighborhood that had once seen hopelessness was now about to witness compassion in motion. And the best part? No one knew it was him, because Jonathan wasn't doing it for fame. He was doing it for faith. He believed kindness meant more when no one clapped. Weeks later, his critics would discover the truth, and their laughter would turn into tears of respect. But that moment was still to come. For now, Jonathan Roumie walked through the noise of judgment, calm, humble, unshaken, a man wearing simple clothes, and carrying a heart woven with grace. The interview room was bright, small, and filled with expensive silence. Jonathan Roumie sat across from a young journalist, confident, polished, with questions sharper than knives. The cameras were rolling. The lights were hot. "So, Jonathan," the reporter began, smiling with that media-trained charm, "everyone's been talking about your wardrobe at last month's premiere. The fans were surprised, let's say." Jonathan nodded slowly, hands folded. "Surprised is one word for it," the reporter laughed. "I mean, most stars show up in Armani or Versace. You showed up in something that looked," she hesitated, "borrowed." A ripple of laughter came from behind the cameras. Jonathan smiled softly, not defensive, not offended. He said calmly, "It wasn't borrowed. It was mine." The journalist tilted her head. "You don't think you owe your fans a little more presentation?" Jonathan leaned forward slightly. "I owe them honesty. If I start dressing to impress instead of express, then I've already lost what makes me real." The clip lasted only 30 seconds. But when it hit social media, it exploded. Millions watched. Millions commented. Some praised his humility. Most mocked his confidence. Spirituality doesn't mean poverty. Stop pretending to be holy. Just admit you can't afford better clothes. The more they insulted him, the calmer he became. He never replied with anger. He just kept showing up, to charity events, church fundraisers, and community dinners, wearing the same kind of simple clothes that had sparked the storm. But the internet is relentless. Soon, late-night hosts joined in. Comedians made sketches. Fashion blogs analyzed his outfits with surgical cruelty. And yet, Jonathan kept smiling, because while they tore him down online, he was quietly building something offline, behind closed doors. His foundation had already begun its largest project, a full-scale renewal of the same community that once laughed at him. The plan: rebuild Grace House, the homeless shelter, expand it into a full resource center, and launch free meal programs for underprivileged families. It wasn't a statement. It was a response, not made of words, but of deeds. Still, even the kindest heart has its breaking point. One evening, Jonathan was leaving a coffee shop when a small group of young fans recognized him. They didn't ask for pictures. They laughed. "Hey, Jesus," one shouted. "Turn that old jacket into Gucci." Another pulled out his phone, recording. "Come on, smile for the camera, prophet of poverty." Jonathan stopped. For a brief moment, he looked at them, not with anger, but with a quiet sadness that made them pause. He said softly, "One day you'll understand that what you wear means nothing, compared to what you carry in your heart." Then he walked away. That night he sat alone in his apartment. No cameras, no lights, just silence. He opened his journal again and wrote, "It's easy to love people who cheer for you. The real test is loving those who laugh at you." He prayed, not for them to be punished, but for them to see that fame fades, fashion fades, But kindness lasts. The next morning, his team received news. Grace House had officially reopened its doors. Fully funded, newly painted, stocked with supplies. Hundreds of people were lined up outside, ready to receive food, clothes, and care. When the local news crew arrived, the director of the shelter, Maria, was in tears. She said, "An anonymous donor made this possible. Whoever they are, they saved this community." Jonathan watched that news report from his couch, smiling faintly. He didn't tell anyone it was him. He didn't post about it. He just whispered, "Thank you," to the God who had given him the means to make a difference. Meanwhile, the same social media pages that once mocked him were still buzzing with new jokes. They had no idea that the man they ridiculed for looking poor was the one feeding hundreds of families that night. But fate has a funny way of turning silence into thunder. And soon the truth would come crashing into the same world that once laughed at him, not through his words but through his works. Because Jonathan Roumie didn't need to defend himself. He was about to prove himself, and the world wasn't ready for what came next. It started with a single photo, a blurry image of Jonathan Roumie standing quietly outside a soup kitchen, helping unload boxes of food. No film crew, no press, just him. Sleeves rolled up, smiling at the volunteers as he carried crates into the back. The person who took the photo wasn't a journalist, just a local man walking by who recognized him and posted it online. The caption read, "Everyone laughed at his clothes. Tonight, he's feeding the same community that laughed." The post spread like wildfire. Within hours, thousands of people shared it, tagging news outlets and fan pages. Comment sections shifted from sarcasm to shock. "Wait, is that really Jonathan Roumie? Hold up, that's the same shelter that reopened last week. Did he fund it?" But no one knew for sure, because Jonathan still hadn't said a word. He kept working quietly, unpacking boxes, handing out meals, laughing with kids, and comforting families who'd lost everything. No spotlight, no speeches, just service. Maria, the shelter director, finally revealed the truth to a small local paper. The donor who rebuilt this place was Jonathan Roumie. He told us not to mention it, but I think people deserve to know what real humility looks like. That article hit the internet like a spark in dry grass. Within minutes, hashtags exploded. Jonathan Roumie kindness, faith in action, real hero. The same pages that once mocked his outfit were now apologizing publicly. Influencers deleted their jokes. Even talk show hosts issued on-air retractions. One said, "Turns out the man we laughed at was saving lives while we were chasing likes." Jonathan's name began trending, but not for fame, not for fashion, for faith. When journalists finally reached him for comment, he gave his signature soft smile and said, "I didn't rebuild the shelter to prove anyone wrong. I did it to remind us what's right." He paused, looking at the cameras, his voice gentle yet firm. "We live in a world that teaches us to look impressive instead of being impactful. But true character isn't measured by your clothes. It's measured by your compassion." The internet fell silent. Clips of that moment went viral, reaching millions around the world. People began posting their own stories at the end of kindness, humility, and faith. Strangers donated to food banks, volunteered at shelters, and tagged him with the caption, "Inspired by Jonathan Roumie." Even celebrities who had once joined in on the jokes reached out privately to apologize. Jonathan responded to each with the same line, "No harm done. Just do something kind for someone else." Meanwhile, at the shelter, life was changing. Children had warm meals again. Families who'd been sleeping in cars now had beds. Elderly men and women smiled through tears of gratitude. And every evening, Jonathan would slip in quietly after filming, still wearing those same old shoes, to serve dinner and talk to people. No cameras, no noise, just love. One night, a little boy tugged at his sleeve and said, "Mister, are you the man who gave us this place?" Jonathan smiled, knelt down, and replied, "Maybe, but what matters is that you have it now." The boy grinned, holding up a paper plate of food. "Then thank you." Jonathan looked around, families laughing, volunteers singing softly, hope in the air, and then whispered, "Thank God." Outside, the media vans waited, but he slipped out the back unnoticed, because he wasn't chasing headlines. He was chasing healing. By morning, his quiet deeds had become the loudest story on the internet. Major networks ran the headline. Fans laughed at Jonathan Roumie's clothes. Then he donated millions to their community. And suddenly, the man mocked for being too humble was being celebrated for showing what humility truly means. But for Jonathan, nothing had changed. He still drove the same old car, still wore the same jacket, still spoke with the same calm voice. Because while the world finally saw the hero, he never stopped being the servant. The sun hung low over the city that evening, painting the skyline gold. The streets outside Grace House were alive, children playing, volunteers chatting, the smell of fresh bread drifting through the air. It was a celebration. The shelter had just completed its first full month since reopening. Over 2,000 people had been fed, dozens had found jobs, and the community had begun to heal. Banners read, "Thank you to our anonymous angel." No one knew he was standing among them. Jonathan Roumie leaned quietly against a wall near the entrance, dressed the same as always, plain shirt, old jacket, no spotlight. He watched as Maria stood on the small stage with a microphone addressing the crowd. "Tonight," she said, voice trembling with gratitude, "we celebrate what faith and kindness can do, and though our donor wished to remain unnamed, I believe it's time everyone knew the truth." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Phones came out. Maria turned and pointed gently toward the corner. "Because that man right there made all of this possible." Heads turned. For a moment, silence fell like a wave. Then the whispers began. "That's Jonathan Roumie." "No way. Wait, he did this?" Jonathan stepped forward, hesitant, humble. The crowd parted, people lowering their phones, unsure whether to cheer or apologize. He climbed onto the small stage as Maria handed him the microphone. He took a deep breath, looked out at the faces, some tearful, some ashamed, many in awe. Then he smiled softly. "A while ago, people laughed at the clothes I wore," he began. "They said I didn't look like success, that I didn't belong among the stars." He paused. "But I've learned something. Real success isn't about shining. It's about sharing." The crowd listened, quiet and still. "You see, I wore what I had, and maybe that didn't impress anyone. But I wasn't trying to impress. I was trying to stay honest." He looked around the shelter, the families eating, the children laughing, the workers who'd given everything. These walls, no, they're not built with fame or money. They're built with faith, with the belief that we're all here to lift each other. A woman in the front row began to cry softly. Jonathan's voice grew gentler. "When people mocked me, I didn't get angry. I prayed that one day they'd understand what matters most. Because the truth is, kindness never needs applause." He lowered the microphone slightly, speaking from his heart now, his words barely above a whisper but carrying through the air. "If my clothes made people laugh, that's fine. Because maybe those laughs helped bring attention to something far more important. This place. These people. This purpose." The crowd erupted, not in cheers at first, but in silence that felt sacred. Then one by one, people began clapping, and slowly, respectfully, until the entire street thundered with applause. Jonathan smiled, nodded, and handed the microphone back to Maria. He turned to leave, but the crowd surged forward, not to mob him, but to thank him. Some reached out to shake his hand. Others simply said, "We're sorry." He stopped beside a young man holding a phone, one of the same fans who'd once posted a mocking video of him. The boy's eyes were red. "Mr. Roumie, I was one of the people who made fun of you. I'm so sorry." Jonathan placed a hand on his shoulder. "Apology accepted," he said softly. "Just promise me something. Next time you see someone being mocked, stand with them, not against them." The young man nodded, tears streaming down his face. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the shelter's lights flickered on, glowing warm and golden, like hope itself. Jonathan stood at the edge of the crowd, looking back one last time. He didn't see cameras. He didn't see critics. He saw people, smiling, forgiving, alive. And in that moment he realized he hadn't just rebuilt a shelter. He had rebuilt hearts. He whispered quietly, "Thank you, Lord, for turning laughter into love." Then he walked away, disappearing into the crowd, a man still wearing the same old jacket, but carrying a story that would inspire millions. The next morning, the world woke up to a story that didn't scream for attention. It whispered straight to the heart. Headlines filled every major outlet. Jonathan Roumie revealed as anonymous, donor behind massive shelter project, actor, who was mocked for his clothes changes, thousands of lives. The star who gave more than money, he gave hope, but Jonathan didn't. Read the headlines. He wasn't interested in what the world thought of him. He cared only about what the world did because of him. At Grace House, something extraordinary began to happen. Volunteers started arriving from neighboring cities. Teenagers who'd once shared memes about him now spent their weekends serving food, repairing roofs, and listening to stories of the homeless. The same young man who'd mocked Jonathan at the shelter that night, the one who'd cried as he apologized, came back the next day with bags of groceries. When Maria asked what inspired him, he smiled and said, "A man who wore humility taught me what wealth really means." The laughter that had once echoed online was now replaced with gratitude. People began sharing stories of small kindnesses. Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers paying for strangers' meals, children donating their pocket money. Each post carried a common tag, "Be like Jonathan." But Jonathan didn't want a movement named after him. He wanted a message to live beyond him. So when he was invited onto a major talk show, he reluctantly agreed, not to defend himself, but to redirect the attention where it belonged. Sitting across from the host, dressed again in his usual simple clothes, he spoke quietly. The world loves the idea of charity, until it asks us to change. But real charity isn't glamorous. It's showing up when no one's watching. It's choosing kindness even when you're misunderstood. The audience was silent. Cameras zoomed in. I'm not perfect. I don't have all the answers. But I know this. If our hearts are full of love, it doesn't matter how empty our closets are. The clip spread faster than any rumor ever had. Within days, donations poured into Grace House from every corner of the world. Other shelters began reopening. Churches started outreach programs in his name. And the most beautiful part? Jonathan didn't take a single dollar of credit. He redirected every bit of attention back to the people, to Maria, to the volunteers, to the families rebuilding their lives. When one reporter asked, "Why stay so humble when you could use this fame to boost your career?" He smiled and replied, "Because careers fade. Character doesn't." Weeks turned into months and the community around Grace House began to thrive. The once empty streets were now filled with laughter, gardens, and music. Murals were painted on the shelter walls, one of them showing a man in a simple jacket holding out a loaf of bread. No label, no name, just the words, "Love needs no brand." Jonathan would sometimes walk past that mural late at night after filming, hands in his pockets, unnoticed by most people. He'd stop and smile, not because it was about him, but because it wasn't. One evening, Maria found him standing there and said softly, "You've changed this place forever." He shook his head. "No, love did that. I just showed up," she smiled. "You showed us how to show up." He laughed quietly, eyes glistening with humility. "Then maybe my old jacket was worth more than I thought." That night, he wrote one final entry in his journal. "When they laughed, I stayed silent. When they mocked, I stayed kind. When they doubted, I stayed faithful. And in the end, love spoke louder than everything." He closed the book, turned off the light, and prayed the same prayer he'd whispered since the beginning. "Use me, Lord, not to be known, but to make you known." And somewhere in that quiet city, in the flickering light of a shelter once forgotten, the sound of laughter had turned into something far greater. It had turned into hope. Months had passed since the night the world discovered the truth about Jonathan Roumie. The headlines had faded, the trends had shifted, and the noise of the internet had moved on to new stories, as it always does. But what remained was the echo of one man's quiet humility that had rippled through thousands of hearts, the echo of kindness that spoke louder than fame, the echo of a single act of compassion that had rebuilt more than a shelter. It had rebuilt faith. In the same neighborhood where laughter had once been cruel, joy now had a home. Children ran through the courtyard of Grace House every morning, their laughter pure and free. Families who once lined up for food now returned as volunteers. People who had once mocked Jonathan now wore shirts that read, "Kindness is the new luxury." And though Jonathan never asked for recognition, life had a way of reminding him how deeply he'd made a difference. One afternoon, while walking through the shelter's hallway, He noticed a bulletin board filled with handwritten letters. He stopped to read them. "Dear Mr. Roumie," one note said in a child's messy handwriting. "Thank you for fixing our house. Now my mom smiles again." Another read, "I used to laugh at you online. Now I laugh with the people I help feed. You changed my heart." He smiled softly, tears filling his eyes. Not tears of pride, but of gratitude. He whispered, "Thank you, God, it was never about me." Outside, the city continued to move, busy, loud, distracted, but in the corners touched by kindness, the pace was different. People greeted each other, helped each other, saw each other, and that was the real miracle. Because Jonathan's story had done something fame never could. It reminded people that humility wasn't weakness. It was strength in its purest form. Soon invitations poured in, from universities, churches, charities. Everyone wanted him to speak about his experience. He turned down most of them. But once, when asked by a small group of students, he agreed. Standing before them, no notes, no stage lights, just truth. He said, "You don't need to be rich to change the world. You just need to care enough to try." He looked around the room, his eyes calm and kind. "People mocked my clothes, but that was never the point. They saw a jacket. God saw a heart. The world measures worth by what's on the outside, but heaven measures it by what you give when no one's looking." The students listened, some wiping their eyes. And for a moment, silence became sacred again. "If someone laughs at you for being humble," he said, "don't let it harden you. Let it remind you that the world still needs examples of gentleness." He smiled, stepped down, and left without waiting for applause, because Jonathan Roumie didn't live for applause anymore. He lived for purpose. Back at home that night, he sat on his porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset melt into the horizon. The city lights blinked awake in the distance one by one. He thought about the beginning, the laughter, the headlines, the humiliation. He thought about how pain can be the seed of something beautiful when you respond with grace instead of anger. And then, softly, almost as a prayer, he said, "Lord, thank you for letting them laugh, because without their laughter the lesson would have never been heard." He leaned back, eyes closed, as the cool wind brushed against his face. Peace, quiet, real, unshakable, filled the air around him. In a world obsessed with luxury, he had proven that love was the greatest wealth. In a culture that celebrated noise, he had shown that silence could speak volumes. And in a time where humility was seen as weakness, he had lived as proof that gentleness could still change the world. So when people tell the story of Jonathan Roumie now, they don't just talk about the actor. They talk about the man who wore grace like armor, the one who turned ridicule into redemption and laughter into light. Because true greatness isn't in the applause. It's in the echo that remains long after the stage goes dark. Respect everyone, especially when you think no one's watching. Because someday the person you laugh at may become the reason you learn to love. Type respect in the comments if you believe humility is the highest form of power. And tell me, where are you watching from? I want to thank every soul who chooses kindness when the world chooses pride.